says the influx of refugees to Europe could help increase economic growth in several countries. Germany, Austria and Sweden took the lion's share of the million refugees who arrived in Europe last year. The IMF predicts that that will help the GDP of those countries increase in 2017, thanks to greater state spending on things like housing, as well as boosting the job market. It says this could lift the GDP of the European Union by 0.25% within 4 years, providing refugees are successfully integrated into labour markets. Such statistics bring into question the economic sense of US presidential hopeful Donald Trump's plan to deport 11 million undocumented migrants. It's estimated that that could shrink the American economy by 6% over 20 years. Contrast this with predictions about the economic benefit of removing all barriers to the movement of labour between countries. It's estimated that that could more than double the world's economic output, largely by increasing wages for workers from developing countries. Well, joining us now in the studio for more on this is Nina Schick from the social and political think tank Open Europe. Thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. So you understand what the IMF is saying here, obviously, and, you know, it's an aging population. You have a lot of the immigrants and refugees that come here tend to be very, very young indeed, so it could work, especially in Europe. But the key phrase here really is integrating skilled refugees into the workforce. I mean, let's just focus on Germany, first of all, because that is the powerhouse of Europe. I mean, have they done it at all, and how easy would it be for them to do it?
Well, it is possible, but history shows that it can be a very painful and challenging, long experience. And the reason for this, right now in Germany, if you look at the German context, they've had 1.1 million people arrive in the country over the past year. So public services are stretched because what they're trying to do now is just meet the basic humanitarian needs of these people. That's shelter, housing, some kind of basic subsistence of living. And whilst their asylum applications are still being processed, these people are not able to access the labour markets. Then the next costs that come on top of that is about learning the language, finding out where your skills can be applied in the economy. So yes, of course, they can be a boost to the economy. But long-term, that, again, depends on how well they integrate into the labour markets. And, of course, there's all kinds of political considerations coming into play as well. What the IMF has said is actually uncontroversial because that's what the German government itself has said, whilst explaining to the German population why the migration crisis could actually serve an economic purpose and serve some kind of boon to German society in the long run.
So sort of, this is something for the long term, because as we heard in Dominic Kane's report, I mean, effectively, first they'd have to learn German or the language of whichever country they're in. A lot of their qualifications will have been lost because obviously their refugees and asylum seekers had to run away. So ultimately, I mean, what kind of time would it be? A year, 2 years, or is it impossible to
Well,
know?
the boost that the IMF is talking about is in the short term, and that's because of the increased number of people that are in the labour market and also increased internal demand due to the influx of people that have arrived in Germany. Again, the IMF also says in their report, long term, that very much depends upon how well people are integrated into German society and labour markets. And that depends on the government's policies.
I mean, you mentioned policies before, and the reality is even in Germany, which has proved to be the most generous of the European countries, ultimately there is resistance, and there has been opposition to Angela Merkel's policy of allowing refugees and asylum seekers in. I mean, how much is what the IMF is saying realistically? Is it really going to wash with the electorates across Europe that we're seeing grow more and more hostile towards immigration?
Well, it's interesting because until last year, Germany had a 3-month ban on refugees before they could enter the labour market. And after the many people arrived, you know, there was a public outcry and they decided to tighten asylum law, which means that now it's a 6-month gap before you can enter the labour market. And all that time, those people who are deemed to come from countries of safe origin, so people such as from the Western Balkans or Afghanistan or Pakistan who can be deported back, they are not allowed to enter the labour market. The point is there are all kinds of restrictions, and Germany has tightened its asylum law precisely because of the mood, the public mood. And I think there's fear that, especially with the refugees and migrants arriving, that they could take away jobs on the low scale of the labour market, which is something that the German policymakers have to take into account.
Absolutely. Nina Schick from Open Europe, thank you.